The Hartwell estate sat at the top of Maplewood Ridge, like a crown no one wanted to wear. From the outside, it was the kind of place that made people slow their cars on the winding mountain road below, rolling down their windows just to stare. 12,000 square feet of modern architecture, all sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling glass, and stone the color of winter clouds. There were gardens manicured to the millimeter, a heated pool that steamed like a quiet secret in the cold mornings, a private driveway lined with Japanese maple trees that bled crimson in autumn. Every inch of it had been designed by the finest architects money could commission. Every inch of it was, somehow, completely and utterly empty. Not empty in the physical sense. There were housekeepers and a rotating staff of nurses and 2 personal assistants who communicated exclusively through whispered tones and careful footsteps. There were fresh flowers delivered every Monday, cream-colored roses, because that was what had always been ordered, and nobody had thought to change the standing arrangement in 2 decades. There were paintings on the walls worth more than most people's homes, and a wine cellar that a sommelier visited quarterly to maintain, and a library with thousands of books organized by the Dewey Decimal System, because once, a very long time ago, the man who owned all of this had loved to read. That man was William Hartwell. At 56 years old, William Hartwell was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. His name appeared annually in financial publications. His company, Hartwell Technologies, had revolutionized medical imaging software in ways that had saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and his philanthropic arm had donated over $300 million to hospitals, research institutions, and children's foundations across the country. On paper, he was the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made man from a modest family in rural Ohio who had clawed and built and innovated his way to the very top. In person, he was a man who had not smiled in 20 years. William sat now at the far end of the East Wing, in the room that had been converted into what his medical team diplomatically called a mobility suite, though William privately thought of it as a cage made of care. His motorized wheelchair was positioned near the window, as it was every morning, facing the valley below. The view was objectively magnificent. Rolling hills, a silver thread of river in the distance, the kind of sunrise that painters spent careers trying to capture. William looked at it every day and felt precisely nothing. The paralysis had come 20 years ago, not from an accident or illness, but from a surgery gone catastrophically wrong. A procedure on a tumor pressing against his spinal cord, a procedure his doctors had called routine, had resulted in permanent paralysis from the chest down. He had been 36 years old. He had been, at that precise moment in his life, happier than he'd ever been. His company was thriving. He had a wife he adored, a woman named Catherine who laughed loudly at her own jokes and made the best lemon cake from scratch and danced in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Catherine had stayed for 3 years. She had been devoted and patient and loving, and William had, in those 3 years, made himself completely impossible to love. The grief of losing his body had curdled into something darker, a cold, consuming bitterness that pushed away everything warm. He had become cutting in his speech and iron in his silences. He had refused therapy, refused support groups, refused every outstretched hand. He had decided, in some locked and unreachable chamber of his heart, that he no longer deserved happiness, and he had set about ensuring he would never accidentally stumble upon it. Catherine had left on a Tuesday in November. She had kissed his forehead and whispered, "I love you, William, but I cannot save someone who won't let me." He had said nothing. He had watched her walk out through the front door without looking back, and he had felt a cold satisfaction that confirmed everything he believed about himself, that he was better alone, that closeness was a cruelty, that warmth was just a prelude to loss. He had not cried. He had not raged. He had simply turned back to the window and remained there in one form or another for the next 17 years. The staff learned quickly what he required: efficiency and invisibility. They were to complete their tasks without unnecessary conversation. They were not to wish him a good morning with any sincerity. He found it performative. They were not to comment on the weather or ask how he had slept or bring him anything he hadn't specifically requested. Several nurses and assistants had quit within weeks, citing not cruelty exactly, but a kind of heavy, suffocating atmosphere that made the air inside the estate feel different from air anywhere else. Thicker, colder, as if the house itself had absorbed its owner's grief and held it in the walls. Dr. Patricia Chun, his primary physician for the past decade, was perhaps the only person who spoke to William with any frankness. "You are in excellent physical health," she told him during quarterly visits, reviewing his charts with the efficiency he preferred. "Your body is doing everything right. I wish I could say the same for your spirit." William would look at her with those flat gray eyes that had once, according to old photographs, been vivid and full of expression, and say nothing. Dr. Chin would sigh, pack her bag, and go. It was their ritual. He had no family left to speak of. His parents had passed within a year of each other a decade ago. His younger sister, Margaret, lived in Portland with her family and called every few months, leaving voicemails that William listened to in full before deleting without responding. He told himself this was a kindness, that he was protecting her from the weight of him. Somewhere beneath that justification, buried under 20 years of scar tissue, was the simpler truth. He didn't know how to let anyone in anymore. He had forgotten the mechanics of it, the opening of the chest, the willingness to be seen. And then, 6 weeks ago, the estate's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, had retired at age 72 with a knee replacement and a tearful farewell that William had observed from his doorway with the distant politeness of a man watching something happen through glass. Mrs. Briggs had been with him for 14 years. He had given her a generous severance and a brief nod. She had cried. He had turned away. The agency had sent a replacement. Her name was Rosa Mendez, 28 years old, with a resume that listed 5 years of private household management experience and a single, almost apologetic note at the bottom. "Please be advised, candidate will require occasional accommodation as she is the sole caregiver of a 14-month-old son. She is professional, highly capable, and completely committed to the role." William's assistant, David, had flagged the note with a small question mark, waiting for instruction. William had stared at it for a long moment. A child. In his house. Every reasonable instinct told him to decline, to request someone else, to preserve the careful, controlled silence he had spent 2 decades constructing. Children were noise and chaos and need, everything he had organized his life to exclude. He had looked back at the window, at the valley, at the unchanging, indifferent view. "Fine," he had said. "Tell them to send her." He hadn't known why he said it. He still didn't. But Rosa Mendez had arrived the following Monday morning with a large tote bag, impeccable references, and a 14-month-old boy asleep against her chest in a baby carrier, his dark lashes fanned against his cheeks, his tiny fist curled around the fabric of his mother's shirt, and something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the cold air of the Hartwell estate. Not enough to call it warmth. Not yet. But something. Rosa Mendez had learned early in life that strength wasn't something you were given. It was something you built, quietly, in the dark, out of whatever materials were available to you. She had grown up in San Antonio, the middle child of 5, in a household that was rich in love and relentlessly short on money. Her father, Ernesto, had worked 2 jobs for most of her childhood, days at a warehouse, evenings doing maintenance at a shopping complex, and her mother, Lucia, had stretched every dollar with a creativity that Rosa had come to understand, only as an adult, was its own form of genius. They had been happy in the essential way, the way that has nothing to do with what you own and everything to do with who is at the table when you eat dinner. Rosa had been a good student, the kind of quietly determined girl that teachers remembered years later. She had earned a partial scholarship to a community college and studied hospitality management with a practical focus of someone who understood that dreams needed architecture, a plan, a foundation, a set of steps you could actually climb. She had worked her way into private household management not through connection, but through sheer reliability, the quality that, in her experience, was rarer and more valuable than almost any other. She had been 25 when she met Daniel. Daniel Reyes had been charming in the way that some people are charming the way a fire is warm, wonderful to be near, until you're too close and realize fire doesn't actually care about you. Rosa had been careful her whole life, and then she had met Daniel and decided, for once, to stop being careful. She had loved him completely and without reservation, and for about a year, it had been the most alive she had ever felt. Then she had gotten pregnant, and Daniel had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of man who uses the word commitment like it's a language he studied but never actually spoken. He had not been cruel about it. That almost would have been easier. He had simply become less and less present, his absences growing longer, his excuses growing thinner, until one afternoon Rosa had looked up and realized she was entirely alone in the apartment they'd shared, surrounded by his things, carrying his child, and understanding with a clear and terrible certainty that he was not coming back. She had packed his things into boxes. She had called her mother. She had cried for precisely one night, loud, ugly, complete, and then she had gotten up the next morning and begun building the architecture for a new kind of life. Mateo had been born on a Thursday in September at 6:47 in the morning, and Rosa had held him in the delivery room with her mother beside her and looked at his face, this small, furious, extraordinary face, and felt something settle in her chest like a key finding its lock. He was hers, completely and absolutely hers. And she was going to give him everything, not because she had everything, but because she was going to work until she did. The early months had been the hardest. She was breastfeeding and job hunting and surviving on 4-hour stretches of sleep, calling her mother every evening just to hear a familiar voice. The private household management positions that paid well enough to cover childcare plus rent plus everything else were the hardest to land. They required experience and references and a flexibility that was at direct odds with having an infant who needed her. She had applied to 14 positions. 12 hadn't responded. One had interviewed her and then called back 2 hours later to say they'd reconsidered the arrangement. The Hartwell position had been the 14th application. She had added the note about Mateo herself, even though the agency coordinator had gently suggested she might want to leave it out until after a first interview. Rosa had shaken her head. She was done starting things with omissions. If William Hartwell couldn't accommodate the reality of who she was, then it wasn't the right position, and she'd find something else. She always found something else. When the agency called to say she'd been approved, she had stood in her small kitchen and pressed a hand over her mouth and breathed. She had arrived that first Monday with Mateo in the carrier, and her chin lifted with the particular dignity of someone who has had to work hard for every room they've walked into. The estate had taken her breath away. She would have been inhuman if it hadn't. But she had tucked that reaction neatly away and focused on the orientation that David, the assistant, provided with brisk efficiency. The house rules were numerous and specific. She absorbed them without expression. And then David had led her to the East Wing, knocked twice on the door and opened it, and Rosa had seen William Hartwell for the first time. She had expected stern. She had expected cold. She had been prepared for difficult. She hadn't been prepared for the quality of stillness that surrounded him, the kind that wasn't peace but its opposite. A stillness made of everything locked down and held under pressure. He sat by the window in his wheelchair, dressed with a precise formality that seemed like its own kind of armor, and he looked at her with gray eyes that assessed without warming, catalogued without curiosity. "You're Rosa," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mr. Hartwell. Rosa Mendez." She met his gaze directly. She had worked for difficult people before, and she had learned that looking away first always made things harder. "And this is Mateo." She touched the back of her sleeping son's head gently. "He won't be a disruption. I want you to know that I take that seriously." William's eyes moved to the baby. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name, there and gone like a light passing under a door. Then it was gone, and the blankness was back. "The household manual is with David," he said. "I expect tasks completed to specification. I don't require conversation." "Understood," Rosa said. She had turned and begun her first day. What she had not anticipated, what she could not have anticipated, was Mateo. Mateo, at 14 months old, was a person of profound sociability and zero comprehension of social norms. He had learned to walk 6 weeks earlier and had taken to this new capability with the evangelical enthusiasm of a recent convert, toddling at surprising speeds in whatever direction interested him. He was not loud in the way some toddlers are loud. He wasn't a screamer or a tantrum thrower. He was simply present, in the total, sensory, whole-bodied way that very small children are present, as if the world were continuously astonishing, and he intended to investigate every inch of it. He was also, for reasons Rosa had never entirely explained, utterly unafraid of strangers. The first time he wandered into the East Wing, on her third day, while Rosa was changing linens and thought he was safely occupied with the soft stacking blocks she'd set up in the hallway, she had looked up from the bed she was making to find him gone. Her heart had lurched into her throat, and she had gone quickly and quietly to find him, following the direction of his little footsteps on the thick carpet. She had found him in William Hartwell's doorway. William was at the window, as always. Mateo had toddled to a stop in the threshold and was staring at the back of the wheelchair with the concentrated interest he gave to all unfamiliar objects. Rosa's breath caught. She moved forward quickly, lips parting to apologize. And then Mateo, apparently having decided the man in the wheelchair was fascinating, lifted one hand and said, with great seriousness, "Bah." It was not a word. It was, as far as Rosa could determine, simply a sound Mateo deployed when he wanted to initiate contact with something that interested him. He said it to dogs, to houseplants, to particularly compelling doorknobs. He said it now to William Hartwell. And William Hartwell, the man who did not require conversation, who had not smiled in 20 years, who had built his entire existence on the premise that warmth was something that happened to other people, slowly turned his wheelchair around. He looked at Mateo. Mateo looked at him. Rosa stood in the hallway and did not breathe. After a long moment, Mateo took 3 decisive steps forward, reached the footrest of the wheelchair, and placed his small palm flat against William's knee with the casual confidence of someone who has decided, unilaterally, that this particular person belongs to him. William stared at that hand, that impossibly small hand. His face did not change, but something in the room did. Rosa quietly stepped forward and scooped Mateo up. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. "He's very—" "You don't need to apologize," William said. His voice was strange, flatter than flat, as if he were working very hard to make it so. Rosa nodded, held Matteo closer, and left the room. But as she walked down the hallway, Matteo looked back over her shoulder toward the east wing and raised his hand in a cheerful, nonsensical wave. And Rosa, glancing back, saw William Hartwell still sitting exactly where she'd left him, still staring at the place on his knee where Matteo's hand had been. There is a particular kind of person who, when they have decided they like someone, does not consult that someone's opinion on the matter. Matteo Mendez was, at 14 months, already deeply this kind of person. Within 2 weeks of Rosa beginning her position at the Hartwell estate, Matteo had made a series of unilateral decisions about William that no one had asked for, and no one could seem to stop. He had decided, evidently, that the man in the wheelchair was his person, not a person he would occasionally visit or regard from a safe distance. His. The possessiveness was serene and total, the way only a toddler's certainties can be, not aggressive or demanding, but absolute, the way gravity is absolute, the way mourning is absolute. Every day followed the same pattern. Rosa would arrive, set Matteo up in whatever designated area she'd arranged for him near her work, a soft play mat, a basket of toys, a board book or two, and every single day, within 20 minutes, he would be gone. Not dramatically, not with any fuss. He would simply stand up, tuck whatever toy he'd been holding under his arm like a briefcase, and walk with the focused purpose of a small man with somewhere important to be, directly toward the east wing. Rosa had, in the first week, intercepted him every time. She had apologized to William, who had each time responded with some variation of the same distant, unreadable dismissal. "It's fine. No need. Carry on." His tone never changed. His face never changed. And yet, and this was the thing Rosa turned over in her mind during the quiet evenings after Matteo was asleep, he never once said don't let him come back. By the second week, she had begun, cautiously, to intercept less. She told herself it was impractical. She couldn't constantly leave her work to retrieve him. She told herself he wasn't bothering anyone, that Matteo was quiet by toddler standards, that William's suite was child-proofed enough by basic logic since there was very little in it at floor level that could harm a small child. She told herself these things, and they were all at least partially true, and she tried not to examine too closely the other truth, the one she observed from the hallway when she checked quietly on them, that William, who sat at his window every morning in that cathedral stillness of his, had begun, on the days Matteo wandered in, to angle his chair slightly differently. Not toward the window, toward the room. Matteo's visits had a predictable choreography. He would arrive, assess the space with grave toddler seriousness, and then select his activity from whatever he'd brought. Sometimes it was the stacking rings, which he would arrange on the floor near William's footrest, and then disassemble and rearrange with the focused intention of someone solving an important problem. Sometimes it was a board book, Goodnight Moon, or the one about the very hungry caterpillar, which he would open, study each page with furrowed concentration, then close and open again. He babbled as he worked, a continuous soft commentary in a language entirely his own, punctuated occasionally by declarative sounds directed at William, as if he were providing updates and expected to be taken seriously. William, for his part, said nothing, but he watched. Rosa noticed. She noticed everything. It was part of what made her good at her job, that his hands, which usually rested with controlled stillness on the arms of his chair, were different when Matteo was in a room. Not animated, but less rigid. The fingers not quite so tightly arranged. The moment that changed something irreversibly happened on a Wednesday in the third week. Rosa had been cleaning the windows in the adjacent sitting room, close enough to monitor without intruding, when she heard a small thump and then a pause, and then Matteo's voice, that earnest, melodic stream of nonsense, take on a different register. She stepped quietly to the doorway. Mateo had tripped on the edge of the area rug and gone down, as toddlers do, with the sudden totality of a small tree falling. He'd landed on his hands and bottom, unhurt, but surprised. He sat there for a moment in that precarious toddler pause, the moment before the verdict, before the small face decides whether this was an adventure or a tragedy. Rosa watched William Hartwell's face during that pause. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Every carefully constructed wall, every 20 years of cultivated distance, every layer of ice. It cracked, right there in that fraction of a second. His face moved, for the first time in what she guessed was a very long time, without his permission. His brow drew together. His jaw tightened. His body, from the chest up, leaned forward in the chair by a fraction of an inch that contained, Rosa somehow understood, the pure involuntary instinct of a person who wants to reach out and catch something before it falls, even when their body cannot. Mateo looked up, found William's face, saw whatever was there, the concern, the attention, the presence that asked wordlessly, "Are you all right?" and apparently decided this was an adventure, because he broke into a wide, gummy grin, laughed his little laugh, and pushed himself back to standing with the philosophical resilience of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed. Then he walked directly to William's wheelchair, reached up, and placed both hands on William's knee, looking up at him with the particular communication of a child who has no words yet for what he's saying, but is saying it unmistakably. "I'm fine. Look at me. I'm completely fine." William looked down at him. His throat moved. Rosa pressed a hand flat against the doorframe to keep herself very still. William lifted his right hand, slowly, as if he'd forgotten the motion existed, as if he were retrieving it from somewhere very far away, and he placed it, gently, on top of Mateo's head. Just rested it there, that large, careful hand on those soft, dark curls. The gesture was so restrained it was barely a gesture. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. But Mateo beamed. He beamed with his entire small body, his shoulders coming up and his eyes crinkling, like a sunflower that has just found the light. And then he went back to his stacking rings on the floor, chattering happily, because the thing he had needed to communicate had been communicated, and he was satisfied. William kept his hand where it was for a moment after the boy had moved away. Then he lowered it back to the armrest. He turned toward the window. Rosa stepped back before he could see her. She stood in the sitting room with a window cloth in her hand and her eyes very bright, and she breathed carefully, in and out, and thought about what it meant, what it really meant, when a person who had not touched another living thing with tenderness in 2 decades reached out for 5 seconds toward a child who hadn't asked for anything except to be seen. She thought it might mean everything. That evening, as she bundled Mateo into his coat to leave, she paused at the door of the East Wing. William was back at the window. Of course he was at the window. "Mr. Hartwell," she said quietly. He turned, fractionally. "Mateo enjoyed his time with you today," she said. Simply. Not making it large, not underlining it, just setting it down like a fact in the air between them. William looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes. He stopped. Started again. "He's a sturdy little person." Rosa smiled. "Yes," she said. "He really is." She left, and behind her, the man at the window sat in his cage of care, and the air in the room was just barely, fractionally, imperceptibly warmer than it had been before. It happened on a Friday, which Rosa would later decide was right. Fridays had always felt to her like the day the week finally exhaled. She had been at the Hartwell estate for exactly 4 weeks. In those 4 weeks, she had memorized the rhythms of a house with the attentiveness she brought to every position, which windows collected the most dust, how William took his morning coffee, black, in a particular matte ceramic mug, at precisely 7:45, placed to his left without comment, Which of the hallway floor panels creaked and needed to be stepped around. How David communicated urgency through the specific frequency of his typing. She had settled into the role with the quiet competence that was her particular gift, being present without imposing, thorough without being intrusive. She had also, in those 4 weeks, begun to see William Hartwell. Not the myth of him, not the figure in the financial press or the profile in the philanthropic reports. The actual man. The man who read, she had discovered, voraciously and eclectically. She had begun finding his tablet left in unusual positions around the suite, and caught enough glimpses to note titles ranging from theoretical physics to Icelandic sagas to memoirs by jazz musicians. The man who, when he thought no one was near, sometimes put his hand against the glass of the window and kept it there, as if feeling for something. The man who had, somewhere beneath all that careful coldness, a precision of language that revealed, when he did occasionally speak, that he had once had a mind that delighted in ideas. She had begun, carefully and without announcement, to leave things. Not personal things. Nothing that could be construed as sentiment or overreach. Small, practical things placed in the natural course of her work, a news summary she printed from his preferred publications, organized and clipped, placed beside the tablet. The fresh coffee at exactly the right temperature, the mug handle angled precisely so. The books on his shelf returned not alphabetically, as they had been before, but grouped by the invisible logic she had observed in his reading patterns. Quiet gestures, the kind you could always explain away as just doing the job. She didn't know if he noticed. He never said. But the morning of the Friday in question, she had come into the East Wing to find him already looking at the printed news summary she'd left the evening before, and when she set his coffee down, he said, without looking up, "The arrangement of the library. Did you do that?" "Yes." "I can put them back if you prefer." "No." Still not looking up. "It's better this way." Rosa had nodded and left, and in the hallway she had permitted herself a small, private smile. That morning, Matteo had been fussier than usual. He was cutting a new tooth, and the night had been disrupted, and he had arrived at the estate in that particular toddler state of wanting to be carried, but also wanting to be put down, of reaching for things and then not wanting them, of existing in a low-grade state of interior conflict that he lacked the language to articulate. Rosa had held him and rocked him during her brief breaks and coaxed him through it with the patient expertise of a mother who knows her child's frequencies, but by mid-morning he had settled into a quieter register, not happy but calmer, the way an exhausted child gets when it's given up on resistance. She had set up his blanket and soft toys in the small sitting room adjacent to the East Wing, the room she'd begun thinking of, privately, as the in-between room, the space that existed between her world and William's, and gone to handle the upper-level cleaning. She had come back down 45 minutes later, following the quiet, following the absence of Matteo's normal soft chatter, and found him in the East Wing. He had climbed, and she genuinely did not understand how he had managed this, but he had, into the low reading chair that sat to the left of William's window position. It was a wide, cushioned chair, low to the ground, positioned near the wheelchair the way a companion piece might be. Matteo had somehow scaled it, arranged himself in the corner of it with the focused purpose of someone who has made a decision, pulled the edge of his small security blanket over himself, and gone to sleep. Right beside William Hartwell, less than 2 feet away from the man's wheelchair. Close enough that when William moved his hand, he could have reached out and touched the sleeping child without extending his arm. Rosa stood in the doorway and could not speak. William did not see her at first. He was looking at Matteo. And this was the thing, the moment, the image that would stay with Rosa Mendez for the rest of her life. William Hartwell was not wearing his face. Not the one he wore for the world, the controlled, distant, sealed expression that had become so habitual it had started to look like his natural state. He had left that face somewhere else, the way people only do when they believe they are completely alone. What was on his face instead was something she did not have a single word for, and so would always, when she later tried to describe it, need many, ache and wonder, and something broken trying to remember how it was whole, and beneath all of it, surfacing through 20 years of careful suppression like a note from a song you'd forgotten you knew, love. Not the love he decided he could no longer have. Not the controlled, approved, safely distant love of a philanthropist who donates to children's hospitals so he can care from a safe remove. Something's immediate. Something happening right now in this room with no distance to protect him from it. He was looking at Mateo's sleeping face, the dark lashes, the slightly parted lips, the small fist curled against the blanket, and he was feeling every single thing he had spent 2 decades not allowing himself to feel, and it was all right there on his unguarded face, nakedly, completely, in the morning light coming through the glass. And then the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile, not a full one. It was the ghost of one. The memory of the muscle movement, the beginning of something that had been buried so long it could only emerge in the smallest increment. The left corner of his mouth lifted, just barely, just for a moment. His eyes changed, something in them, some held quality, released. He looked like a man who had just heard, from somewhere very far away, the faint sound of something he had given up waiting for. Rosa stepped back silently into the hallway. She pressed her back against the wall. Her eyes were burning. She stood there for 5 minutes, listening to the quiet, the ordinary quiet of a sleeping child and a man sitting beside him, and she thought about how extraordinary the ordinary is if you have been long enough without it. When she went back, she moved quietly to the doorway and stopped. William's eyes came up and found her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. In the chair between them, Mateo slept on, deeply and completely, the way small children sleep when they feel entirely safe. He found his way in here, Rosa said softly. I'm sorry, Rosa. William's voice was different. Not performing calm, actually calm. And underneath it, something that trembled faintly. Leave him. She nodded. She left them there together. The paralyzed man who had not smiled in 20 years, and the 14-month-old boy who had apparently decided, with the sovereign certainty of the very young, that this particular man needed someone to sleep beside him. After that Friday, things changed in the Hartwell estate in the way that substantial things change. Not with announcement, not with drama, but with the slow, unmistakable quality of a season turning. You cannot say on which exact day winter became spring. You can only say that one morning you looked up and the air was different, and understood that something had shifted while you were attending to other things. William began to leave the East Wing.
This was not a small thing.
For nearly 2 years, since his previous housekeeper had retired and the position had been empty for a stretch, he had kept almost entirely to his suite and the immediate adjacent spaces. The house, enormous as it was, had contracted around him until he occupied only its eastern edge, the rest of it becoming a set of beautiful, expensive rooms that existed in his awareness the way a country you've never visited exists. Real, presumably, but entirely abstract. He began, in the week after Mateo's sleep beside him, to venture out. Not dramatically. He would not have tolerated dramatics, and Rosa, who understood this with the instinct of someone paying close attention, did not make them. She simply never commented on it when his wheelchair appeared in a new part of the house. She did not say, "Mr. Hartwell, how wonderful to see you in the library," or "It's so nice that you're coming to the kitchen." She treated his presence in new spaces the same way she treated all his preferences, with a calm matter-of-factness that communicated, without words, "This is simply the way things are, and I see nothing unusual in it." Matteo, of course, had no such restraint, and expressed his delight every time William appeared in his vicinity with the unfiltered enthusiasm of someone who has not learned to modulate joy. He would look up from whatever he was doing, spot William, and his entire face would open like a window thrown wide, this enormous, gummy, full-body beam of recognition and welcome. He would toddle over, sometimes at alarming speed, and place his hands on William's knee in the gesture that had already become, in its way, his greeting, his particular hello, the physical sentence that meant "You, specifically, are someone I am very glad to see." William, for his part, responded to this with a stillness that was no longer the old stillness, no longer sealed and pressurized, but something softer, like the stillness of someone who is very carefully holding something they're afraid to drop. He began to talk to Matteo, not in the way adults usually talk to toddlers, that reflexive, slightly performative narration of the obvious. He talked to him the way you talk to someone you are not sure can understand you, but are going to respect anyway. He would say things quietly while Matteo played nearby, observations and remarks without expectation of response, the way people sometimes speak in an empty church, less to communicate than to let something out. Rosa was present for these moments and took great pains not to be obviously present. She overheard things in the ordinary course of movement through the house. She overheard William tell Matteo one afternoon that the river in the valley below had been called by a different name by the people who lived here before European settlement, and that he had learned this from a book when he was a young man and had always found it important to know the older names of things, because it meant remembering who had been here first. She overheard him say, on a rainy Tuesday while Matteo was methodically unstacking and restacking a set of wooden blocks, "My mother used to say that patience was just another word for trust. I was 30 years old before I understood what she meant. I'm still not sure I do, fully." She overheard him talking about music, about mathematics, about a summer he had spent in Oregon at 17, hiking terrain so remote that for 3 days he had seen no one, and how it had been the loneliness he'd chosen, and therefore the most free he'd ever felt, and how he had not thought about that summer in a very long time. He was excavating himself, slowly in fragments, with no audience but a toddler who listened with round, attentive eyes and occasionally offered a block or a toy car in response, which was, Rosa thought, exactly the right kind of listening. The conversation, when it finally happened, came on an evening in the 5th week, when Rosa was staying late to help prepare the estate for a quarterly visit from William's medical team. She had put Matteo down in the portable crib she'd set up in the small sitting room, the in-between room, and he had gone down easily, exhausted from an afternoon of determined exploration. She had gone to let William know she'd be working late, stepping into the east wing to find him at the window in the blue evening light, the valley below dissolving into dusk. "Matteo's asleep," she said. "I'm going to work on the preparation for Dr. Chen's visit tomorrow. I'll be finished in about an hour." "Sit down, Rosa." She paused. He had never used her first name before. He had never asked her to sit. She sat in the companion chair, Matteo's chair. She had started thinking of it, and waited. William was quiet for a moment. The valley darkened outside the glass. "How long has it been since his father was in the picture?" he asked. Rosa was quiet herself for a moment, not surprised exactly, but checking her own steadiness. "Since before he was born, essentially." We separated when I was pregnant. And you've managed entirely on your own. My mother helps when she can. She's in San Antonio." William nodded slowly. "He doesn't know what he's absent from," he said. It wasn't a question. It had a weight to it that Rosa recognized was not entirely about Matteo's father. "No," she said gently.
He doesn't.
Another silence. William's hand was on the armrest, and in the blue light Rosa could see the lines of it, a hand that had once, presumably, done all the things hands do, typed and built and reached and held. "I had a wife," he said. "Catherine. She left 3 years after the surgery. I told myself I drove her away. I did drive her away. I've been using that as evidence ever since. Evidence for a conclusion I'd already decided on." Rosa said nothing. She understood that what was needed here was not response, but presence. "He sat next to me," William said. His voice was barely above quiet. "A child I have no claim to, no right to, who has no reason in the world to choose me, and he simply sat next to me and fell asleep. As if it were the most natural thing. As if I were," he stopped. "Safe," Rosa offered very softly. He looked at her. And what was in his eyes? All of it, the 20 years, the surgery, the window, Catherine, the empty house, the unlived life. It was there, none of it hidden, and he was letting her see it, which was, she understood, the largest thing he had done in a very long time. "I don't know how to," he stopped again. Tried again. "I don't know how to stop believing I'm only capable of pushing things away." "I know," Rosa said. She held his gaze. "But you haven't pushed Matteo away. He keeps coming to you, and you keep letting him. That's not nothing, Mr. Hartwell. That's actually everything." His jaw worked. He turned back to the window. But he didn't ask her to leave. And so Rosa stayed in the chair as the valley went fully dark, and they sat in the quiet together, the paralyzed man and the young mother, while in the next room a 14-month-old boy slept the perfect, oblivious sleep of a child who has absolutely no idea that he has, in the space of 5 weeks, done what 20 years of distance could not undo, brought someone back from the far country of the self. One small, insistent visit at a time. It was the morning of a Sunday in October, and the maple trees along the driveway had gone fully crimson, and the light had the quality it gets in autumn, golden and specific, the kind that lands on things and makes them look like they're being remembered rather than seen. Rosa had not been scheduled to work on Sundays. But 3 weeks ago, William had asked David to adjust her schedule to include Sunday mornings, framed in the language of housekeeping needs, but understood by everyone, including David, who was observant, to be about something else entirely. She arrived at 8, Matteo bundled in a rust-orange sweater his grandmother had sent from San Antonio, his dark hair slightly wild from sleep, holding his cloth rabbit against his chest with the deep seriousness of a person with important cargo. He had learned, by this point, several new words. He could say mama and more and no, with great frequency and emphasis, and dog, applied to all animals, regardless of species, and something that sounded enough like, well, that Rosa's heart did a complicated thing every time she heard it. He had started saying it approximately 12 days ago. He had walked into the East Wing that morning, spotted William at the window, and announced, with tremendous satisfaction, "Will." William had turned around. Rosa, from the doorway, had watched the expression that crossed his face, a kind of struck, dazed look, as if something had landed that he had no defense against, because he had never thought to build one there. "Hello, Matteo," he had said. His voice had been completely unsteady. Matteo had not noticed or cared. He had toddled over, climbed, still somewhat inexplicably, into his chair, and opened Goodnight Moon. This Sunday morning, Rosa settled into the regular rhythms of the estate, while Matteo made his way to the east wing with the purposeful independence he now navigated the house with. She heard, from upstairs, the familiar pattern of it, Matteo's footsteps, the pause at the doorway, William's voice saying, "Good morning, Matteo," with the warmth that had, over these weeks, replaced the careful blankness. She worked through the upper floor, cleaned, prepared, listened to the house breathe around her. An hour passed. She came downstairs with fresh linens and paused at the in-between room to check through the connecting doorway. She had not intended to stop. She had not intended to stay. But what she saw made her go absolutely still. Matteo, who had been awake since early and had missed part of his morning nap, had crawled, she still didn't understand his climbing methodology, into William's lap. Not beside him. Not near him. In his lap. He was sitting in William Hartwell's lap, leaning back against the man's chest with the complete physical confidence of a child who is determined, past all argument, that this is a place he belongs. He had brought his rabbit, which he was holding up and examining with the exploratory attention he brought to things he found compelling, and he was narrating something in his ongoing private language, and William's arms, those arms that had been at his sides for so long, controlled and contained and never reaching, were around him. Not stiffly. Not with the self-consciousness of a person who doesn't know what they're doing. Around him, the way arms go around a child you are holding, loosely and warmly, and with the ease of something natural. William's chin was tilted down toward Matteo's head. He was looking at the rabbit that Matteo was holding up, and Matteo was saying something about it. And William was... Rosa pressed her free hand over her mouth. William was listening. Listening with the complete, undefended, fully present attention of a man who has stopped protecting himself from the moment he's in. And then Matteo, for reasons best understood by Matteo, turned and looked up at William's face from approximately 4 inches away, tilted his small face straight up, the way children do when they want to see all of someone at once, and he reached up with one small hand and put his palm flat against William's cheek. The same gesture he'd made on that very first day against William's knee. But this time his hand on his face, skin to skin, looking straight at him. William looked down at him. For a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. And then William Hartwell smiled. Not the ghost of one. Not the fragment or the trembling beginning. A real smile, complete and whole, starting at his eyes, those gray eyes that went, in the space of a heartbeat, from guarded to open, actually open. Open the way a window is open when you've thrown the latch for the first time in a long winter, and spreading, slow and full and unmistakable, across his face. 20 years. 20 years since anyone in this house had seen this man smile. 20 years since he had felt it come, felt it rise without his permission, felt his face do the thing a face does when something inside it has stopped fighting and let something in. Rosa's vision blurred. She did not try to stop it. Matteo, upon receiving this smile, responded with the immediate and complete delight of a child receiving confirmation of something he'd always known. He broke into his own grin, enormous, gleeful, that whole-body sunshine expression, and made a happy sound and turned back to his rabbit, entirely satisfied, as if he had been waiting patiently for exactly this, and was now free to return to other business. William's smile didn't fade right away. It stayed, trembling and real, and he looked out over the boy's head to the window, to the valley, to the crimson trees along the drive, and something in his face was being remade, right there in the golden October light, not restored to what it had been before, because you cannot go back, and he would not want to, but made into something new. A man who's been broken and has begun, against all his own expectations, to become whole in a different shape. Rosa stepped back. She walked to the kitchen. She sat down at the small table near the window where she sometimes ate her lunch when the estate was quiet, and she put her face in her hands, and she let herself cry. Not sad tears, not the tears of grief or loss, but the particular tears that come when something that was wrong for a very long time becomes, quietly and completely, right.
She sat there for a while.
Then she wiped her eyes, stood up, put the kettle on, and made 2 cups of coffee, his in the matte ceramic mug, to the left, no comment, and carried them back toward the east wing. She stopped in the doorway. Matteo had fallen asleep again, there in William's arms, the rabbit tucked under his chin, completely limp with the total surrender of a sleeping child. William was sitting very still, holding him, looking out at the maple trees going red along the drive. He heard her. He looked over. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The maid, 28 years old, who had come to this house with her son, and her quiet competence and her refusal to look away from difficult things, and the billionaire, 56 years old, who had spent 20 years building the most expensive, impenetrable solitude that money could construct, and had just had it entirely dismantled by a 14-month-old boy with a cloth rabbit and no concept of the word impossible. Rosa set his coffee down to the left, handle angled correctly. She straightened up. "He's heavy," she said softly, nodding toward Matteo. "I can take him." "No," William said. Quietly. Firmly. The way people say things they mean all the way through. He looked back at Matteo's sleeping face. Then back at Rosa. "Thank you," he said. She understood he did not mean for the coffee. "You're welcome," she said. She understood what she was thanking him for in return. She went back to her work, and in the East Wing, in the golden light of an October morning, the paralyzed man who had not smiled in 20 years sat with a sleeping child in his arms and looked out at the crimson trees and the silver river far below, and breathed, and stayed, and let himself be, not fixed, because grief does not work that way, but accompanied, because that is, in the end, what any of us are ever really looking for. Not rescue. Just someone who refuses to stop showing up. And in 14 months of living, Matteo Mendez, who knew nothing of tragedy or armor or the long wars people fight inside themselves, had already, instinctively, completely, understood this. He had shown up. He had stayed. He had reached up and placed his hand against a closed face and waited, with the infinite patience of the very young, for it to open. And it had. It had. Some of the most profound healings in this world are never announced. They happen in ordinary rooms, in the quiet hours, between people who had no plan to save each other, and a small child who never knew there was anything to save.